You've seen the person I'm about to describe, maybe at a stoplight, maybe in your neighborhood, maybe at work. They pull up in a $50,000 truck, the kind with the lifted suspension and the chrome and the badge that costs an extra $4,000 by itself. The windows are tinted, the sound system is loud. They look, by every visible measure, like they're winning, and you're sitting in your paid-off sedan, doing the math in your head, wondering why you feel behind. That feeling, that small, quiet, wait, am I doing this wrong feeling, is the most expensive feeling in personal finance. Not because it costs you a truck, because of what it tempts you to do next. I'm Nora. I look at financial systems for a living. And the case I want to open today is one I've watched play out in thousands of household balance sheets, and it always follows the same shape. Real wealth, the kind that actually shows up at 65, behaves nothing like what people expect in their 30s and 40s. It moves in a way that almost feels designed to make you give up right before it starts working. So today, we're going to look at why wealth feels slow. We're going to look at the exact points where it stops feeling slow. We're going to look at the moves that interrupt that jump, even when you're doing almost everything else right. And we're going to end with a single, clean rule you can actually use, starting tomorrow. Quick note before we open the file. Nothing I say today is personal financial advice for your specific situation. I don't know your numbers. I don't know your goals. I don't know your tax picture. This is a pattern walk, the way a detective might walk you through how a certain kind of case usually unfolds. Take it as a lens, not a prescription. Okay, let's open the file. Here's the thing nobody tells you when you start saving and investing seriously. For a long stretch, and I mean a longer stretch than the internet will admit, your portfolio doesn't feel like it's doing anything. You put in money, the market moves, sometimes up, sometimes down. You check the balance, and it's higher than last month, sometimes lower, but it's never the kind of number that makes you feel rich. It just feels like a number. You start to wonder if you're doing it wrong. I want to be very specific about what's actually happening in that phase, because most people misread it. In the early years of building wealth, almost all of your account growth is coming from one thing: your own contributions. You put in $5,000, the balance goes up by roughly $5,000, plus or minus what the market did. The market's contribution looks like noise. Your savings are doing the heavy lifting. That's not a failure of compounding. That's compounding behaving exactly the way compounding behaves. Compounding is the math of returns earning returns. And early on, there's almost nothing in the account for returns to earn returns on. The engine is technically running, it's just running on a fuel tank this size of a shot glass. So you keep going, you stay in the index funds, you keep auto-investing, you keep your expenses reasonable, and the balance grows in this stubborn, linear, almost boring way. Year 1, you've got 15,000. Year 3, you've got 50. Year 5, you've got 110. You start to think, okay, maybe this is just what it looks like. Maybe wealth is just a slow accumulation of contributions, forever. And that is the moment when the case usually turns. Because that is not what it looks like. That's just what the first chapter looks like. The flat phase is not the system failing. The flat phase is the runway. Compounding doesn't go off like a starting gun. It goes off like a tipping point. It feels like nothing, and then it feels like nothing, and then one day it doesn't. The reason most people miss it is simple. They quit watching for the jump. Or worse, they make a move that prevents the jump from ever arriving. So let's put the evidence on the board. Let's look at the actual points where the math starts helping you, instead of the other way around. The first one is what I call the first meaningful compounding threshold. It's not a magic number. It's different for every household. But there's a point, usually somewhere between $100,000 and $250,000 in invested assets, depending on your contribution rate and your market exposure, where the account starts moving in a way that feels noticeably different. Here's the math, and I'm going to keep it simple.
Say you've got $100,000 invested in a broadly diversified portfolio. Over long periods, people often model around returns in the high single digits on average. Not every year, not reliably. Some years more, some years much less, some years negative. I'm using a long-run planning average as a thinking tool, not a promise.
On $100,000, an average year of growth is maybe $8,000 of market return. That's roughly what a serious saver might be contributing in a year out of their paycheck. So at $100,000 invested, the market is starting to match what you're putting in. Your money is for the first time pulling its own weight. That sounds small. It is not small. It's the moment your savings stop being the only engine. The second threshold is the one almost no one talks about. It's when compounding starts to overtake contributions. That tends to happen somewhere between $250,000 and $500,000 in invested assets, again, depending on your contribution rate. At that point, in a normal market year, your portfolio is gaining more from market growth than you are adding from your paycheck. Even if you stopped contributing, which I'm not suggesting you do, the account would keep growing meaningfully on its own. You've crossed the line from "I am building this" to "this is now building itself, and I'm helping." That's the one people don't see coming, because nothing about that line shows up in their daily life. There's no notification, no fireworks. The grocery bill is the same, the paycheck is the same, but the underlying machine has flipped polarity. The wealth is now generating wealth faster than the saver is feeding it. Then we get to the household level jumps, and these are the ones that don't get talked about enough on finance channels because they're not about the brokerage account at all. They're about cash flow. If you have a mortgage, the real cash flow jump arrives when that payment actually ends, or when a deliberate refinance or downsizing move truly reduces it. We're talking in many parts of the country, $1,500, $2,000, $2,500 a month that used to leave the household and now doesn't. That money has to go somewhere. If it goes into more lifestyle, it disappears. If it goes into investing, it accelerates everything we just talked about, sometimes dramatically. If you have kids, the year they finally launch, and I know, launch is doing a lot of work in that sentence. Kids these days launch on a sliding schedule. But the year their major expenses come off your budget, that's another cash flow jump. Childcare ends, activities end, tuition ends, the grocery bill comes down. Suddenly, the household has a different savings capacity than it had for 15 years. And then there's the catch-up years. The IRS, in its strange wisdom, lets people 50 and older put more into retirement accounts than younger people can. Most households are also in their peak earning years in that window. So you have higher income, lower household expenses, and higher allowable contributions, all converging at the same time. That's not a small jump. That's a structural shift in how fast wealth can be built. So that's the evidence board. 4 to 5 points where the system stops feeling slow. The first, compounding threshold, where market growth starts to match your contributions. The crossover, where market growth overtakes your contributions. The mortgage payoff, refinance, recast, or downsizing move that truly frees up monthly cash. The kid launch transition, that reduces household burn. The catch-up window, where income peaks and contribution limits expand at the same time, none of these points feel dramatic in the moment. You don't get a confetti animation when your portfolio crosses the line. But this is when wealth actually starts behaving the way the internet promised it would. Now, this is the part of the case where we have to talk about the traps. Because if it were just a matter of waiting, everyone who started early would get there. And they don't. Plenty don't, actually. So something is interrupting the jump, and it's almost always one of 3 things. The first trap is status spending. This is the truck. This is the watch. This is the kitchen remodel that wasn't really about the kitchen. I'm not here to shame anyone for buying nice things. I genuinely don't care what you drive. What I care about is the math underneath. And the math underneath status spending is almost always worse than it looks. A $50,000 vehicle
financed over 6 or 7 years, with insurance, with maintenance, with the gas it takes to move that much metal around, that's not a $50,000 decision. That's, depending on your situation, an $800 to $1,200 monthly decision that runs for most of a decade.
Multiply that by the alternative, what that same money could have done if it were in your invested assets, earning its way toward those tipping points. And the gap isn't a rounding error. The gap is years of progress, sometimes more than a decade of progress. And here's the part that stings. The person in the truck doesn't feel rich. They feel stretched. The truck made the lifestyle visible, but it didn't make the wealth real. Real wealth is, in most households, invisible. Fake wealth, the leased and financed and minimum payment kind, is extremely visible. That's the inversion most people never get told. The second trap is impatience. This is the one I see in the comment sections every week. People look at their account, see that the flat phase has lasted 3 years, 4 years, sometimes longer, and they decide the boring system isn't working. So they start reaching, they start chasing. They go heavy into a single stock because it ran last quarter. They go into a leveraged product without understanding the decay. They take a flyer on something a guy in a podcast was excited about. The boring system wasn't broken. It was working exactly the way the math says it should. They were 2 or 3 years away from the first compounding threshold. They were just inside the runway, and they hit the eject button. The third trap is lifestyle inflation that travels with income. This is the silent one. You get a raise, you move into a bigger place. You get another raise, you upgrade the car. You get a bonus, you take the bigger vacation. None of it feels reckless. None of it feels like a problem. Each individual decision is, frankly, reasonable. Let's make that concrete. Say your take-home pay rises by $600 a month. If all $600 quietly disappears into a nicer car, a slightly higher mortgage payment, more eating out, and a handful of subscriptions you barely notice, then the raise changed your lifestyle, but not your trajectory. If $300 of it gets captured automatically into investing, and the other $300 improves your life, that's a completely different household math story 10 years later. Same raise, different system result. But what happens is the cash flow jump never arrives. The mortgage payoff doesn't free up cash because there's a bigger mortgage now. The kids launching doesn't free up cash because the household burn rate kept growing with the income. The catch-up years arrive, but the contribution capacity isn't there because the lifestyle absorbed it. Income doesn't build wealth. The gap between income and lifestyle builds wealth. That's not a slogan. That's an accounting identity. Those are the 3 traps. Status, impatience, and lifestyle drift. Any one of them, run long enough, can interrupt the jump. And the cruel part is, they tend to feel best in the exact years when staying the course feels worse. Now let's pan the camera out, because the reason any of this matters isn't really about the next 5 years. It's about what these choices look like, compounded over 20, 30, 40. I want you to picture 2 households, same income, same starting point, same age, same number of kids, almost the same life on the outside. Household A makes a quiet choice early on. They live a little below what they could. They drive cars longer. They take the vacations they actually want, but not the ones the internet told them to want. They auto-invest. They don't reach for hot stocks. They don't pull out when the market gets ugly. They get the mortgage to a small balance. They roll the freed cash flow into investments instead of upgrades. They hit the catch-up window with capacity to use it. Household B looks more impressive at every 5-year checkpoint. Nicer cars, bigger house, more visible upgrades, the kind of household their neighbors assume is doing better. They also save, they also invest. But the gap between their income and their lifestyle is smaller, year after year, decade after decade. At 65, these 2 households are not in the same retirement. Household A is in a position where their invested assets can sustain their actual cost of living, probably with room to spare. They have flexibility. They can choose to keep working because they enjoy it or stop because they want to. They can help kids and grandkids on their own terms. The system is finally working entirely for them. Household B is in a much narrower position. Their invested assets are real, but they're not enough to support the lifestyle they built. Some of them downsize. Some of them keep working not because they want to, but because they have to. Some discover, painfully, that the visible wealth was always thinner than it looked. And here is the part of the case file I want to be very careful with, because this is not about judging Household B. Household B isn't reckless. Household B isn't stupid. Household B made a series of completely reasonable-looking decisions, each one defensible on its own. The problem is that the system rewards the gap, and they kept closing the gap. This is also why two people with very similar incomes can end up in completely different retirement realities. It's almost never about which one got lucky in the market. It's almost always about which one let the slow phase do its work and which one interrupted it. I think a lot about a phrase I keep returning to. The slow phase is not proof the system is failing. The slow phase is the system loading. You quit during the loading screen, you never see the game. Okay, let's close the file with something you can actually use. If everything I just said is true, and the household balance sheets I've spent years looking at say it is, then the move isn't to find a better fund. The move isn't to find a smarter strategy. The move isn't to chase a hotter return. The move is to protect the boring engine from your own impatience until it has time to do what it does. So here's what I'd actually track. Not what I'd tell you to buy, what I'd track. Track your savings rate, not your account balance. The account balance will lie to you in both directions during the slow phase. It'll feel disappointing when the market is sideways. It'll feel exhilarating when the market is up. Neither feeling is information. Your savings rate, the percentage of your gross income that is going into long-term invested assets, is the only number that's actually under your control. If that number is going up over time, the system is working, regardless of what the balance is doing this quarter. Track the gap between your income and your lifestyle. Every time your income goes up, ask the boring question. What percentage of this raise is going into the engine, and what percentage is going into the lifestyle? There's no universal right answer, but all of it into lifestyle is the answer that quietly disables the jump we've been talking about. Even sending half of every raise into investments automatically before you ever see it in your checking account is enormously powerful over a career. If your income rises by $500 a month and you decide in advance that $250 of it goes straight into investing, you have protected the system before lifestyle gets a vote. Track your fixed monthly burn, specifically the part that's hard to undo: housing, cars, insurance, subscriptions that don't end. The reason this matters is that the cash flow jumps we talked about, the mortgage payoff, the kid launch, the catch-up window, only show up as actual wealth jumps if your fixed burn doesn't grow to swallow them. The lower and more flexible your fixed burn, the more those jumps actually arrive. And if you're a late starter, this still matters. The point is not that you had to begin at 22 to benefit from the system. The point is that once you understand what actually drives the jump, you can stop wasting years waiting for motivation and start protecting the gap you still have. And the clean move, the one rule I'd send you home with, is this. When wealth feels slow, do less, not more. The instinct when the account isn't moving the way you want it to is to make a bigger move. Take a bigger swing, try a new strategy, add a new account, find a new guru. Almost every time, the right answer is the opposite. Make the boring system more automatic. Make it harder for yourself to interfere with. Set the contributions on autopilot. Rebalance on a schedule, not on a feeling. Look at the account less, not more. And give the runway the time it needs to end. Because here's the thing. The truck at the stoplight is not your competition. The neighbor with the bigger house is not your competition.
The coworker whose lifestyle looks louder than yours is not your competition. Your only real competition is the version of you 2 years from now who got tired and reached for something hot, or the version of you who saw a raise and absorbed all of it into the monthly burn, or the version of you who, somewhere in the slow phase, decided the system wasn't working and quit.
Don't be that version of you. Be the boring one. Be the one who lets the runway finish. Wealth feels slow until it doesn't. The moment it stops feeling slow is usually invisible from the outside. Nobody sees the compounding crossover. Nobody throws a party for a paid-off mortgage. Nobody high-fives you for not buying the truck. But that's where the wealth actually lives, not in what's parked in the driveway, in what's compounding quietly while you stop watching the score. That's the case. Stay patient, stay boring, protect the gap. And the next time the slow phase makes you feel behind, remember, it may simply mean the system is still loading, not that it's broken. I'll see you in the next one.